Today's daf, we started this week a new Masechta, and we are Masechet Zevachim, which is very, very exciting and very challenging too at the same time. Today's daf is daf Vav, number 6. And we're really in our initial discussion, I would say, about halachot of karbanot and intentionality that has to do with karbanot, right? That was the original Mishnah. What is how much intention? What happens if you have the wrong intention? What if it's a karban that you change all kinds of details? We'll get into more. But the question that came up yesterday, and we're sort of in the middle, he said he's up to Amrle Reb Asi, I believe, which is around 11 lines from the top. But I'm actually going to go back because it's the middle of a sentence. So I'm going to start from the fourth line. The last word on the fourth line on Daf Vav Amud Aleph, which is Mat Kifla Rebbe Yaakov. So again, the issue that we're talking about here is a question of if you bring a karban for your shim, right? If someone dies and they leave a karban that they've already dedicated to their either your shim, whatever you call it, inheritors, can they bring that karban? Because you obviously can't bring it for the person who's dead, or in theory. So you're basically bringing a karban not for its owners, you're bringing it for the new owners, right? So that was what we sort of discussed yesterday. And we said that the challenge is that you can maybe bring a karban, but then how could you make it a tumura? Because the only way you can make a karban a tumura is meaning if you say to an animal that's standing there, I want this animal's kedusha to go on another animal. The Torah says don't do that, right? You're not allowed to do that. And if you do it, the kedusha goes on both animals. It goes to the new one and it stays on the old one. But that's only effective if you're getting a kapara from that animal. So Matkif Rabbi Yaakov ben Harpakut. Now let's get to Rabbi Yaakov ben Harpakut said, well, I don't get it. Elamiata gabi maaser. What about by a karban maaser? Remember, a karban maaser is the 10th animal, right? You have a lot of animals born in a year.
Ali, can you just repeat where you are?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on the fourth line of Daf Vav Amud Aleph. The last word on the list.
Thank you.
Vav Amud Aleph. So Matkif Rabbi Yaakov ben Harpakut. Elamiata, if this principle is true, gabi maaser, karban maaser, which again is the animal that is brought as the 10th animal. Hi, Charlie, I'm going back a few lines just because of the sentence. The fourth line from the top of Daf Vav. But gabe maaser, by a karban maaser, again, you have animals that are born, you take aside, the 10th animal is brought as a karban. Tichtiv, it says there, mim ga'al yig'al, right? If the animal gets redeemed, then you have to add a fifth to that. And says the Braita, l'rabot et yoresh, that includes a yoresh. Now, hachanami echad goel ve'in shnaim goalim. Would you say the same thing is true here? That only one child, right? Because we were dashing yesterday was from the word imhamir yamir, was that only one son or one child can do tumura, not two. So ask Rav Yaakov, what about the pasuk ga'ol yigal? Which are you saying that means only one child who inherits an animal does take off extra chomesh if they redeem it and not shnaim goalim? And he answers, Shani Maaser. Maaser is different. The Gabi Avuhon Nami Ita B'Shutfut, because even the father could have owned an animal with a partner and still been chayiv in Maaser. So Maaser can happen among multiple owners, so therefore can happen among multiple yorshim. But Tumura, which is where we started, exchanging kedusha from one animal to another, cannot happen among partners. Amal Ravasi the Ravashi. Now this is what he got up to. What said Ravasi the Ravashi? Umina. But then follow the logic of your statement, meaning, if you say that when a father dies and leaves an animal to his children, they get a kinyan, it becomes their animal. So now I understand that if it's one son who inherits him, one son can do tumura because he's the full owner. If there are multiple sons, they can't because there's no such thing as tumura by partners. But at least one should do it. If you're saying, and this is where we started this conversation, does the Yoresh become in place of the father? If he doesn't, how in the world could he do Tumura? Because we do have this famous, and we're going to quote this many times in this Masechta and throughout Kachim, Rabbi Yavo said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, 3 important principles. The first principle, we are, I don't know, somewhere, Hamakdish, around 10 lines down, is hamakdish mosif chomish. The person who makes something hektish brings a chomish on it. Meaning, let's say a person set aside an animal for somebody else. Meaning, Reuven said, "I want to bring a karban," and Shimon said, "Oh, I'm happy to donate my animal for that. My animal is given to you for your karban." Then the question is, who's the owner? Is it Reuven who's getting a kapara, or Shimon who gave the animal? So said Rabbi Avon, then Rabbi Yochanan, the one who made the animal kodesh, Shimon in this case, is the owner, and if he redeems it, he has to add a fifth. Okay, that's one principle, not relevant for us. Mitkabero set tmura, which is relevant for us. The one who gets a kapara is the one who can make an animal into tmura. And we're going to get back to that's the question we're asking from. And hatorei mishalo shal chavero tovatana shalo. Let's say again the same story. Shimon has a lot of grain that needs truma. Reuven says, "I'll do you a favor. I'll take off truma for your grain." He goes into his house. He takes a portion, a 50th, 2%. Takes this is truma. So who owns that truma? Meaning who owns truma that goes to a kohen. But remember, you can sell your truma to a kohen, right? Not directly, but you can get a kohen's father-in-law, who's not a kohen, to pay you money to give the truma to his son-in-law. And so that tovat hana'ah belongs to the person who gave off the truma. But what you see from this principle is that a person who makes tamura has to get a kapara from that animal, or they can't make tamura. And we just said that there's a debate whether a son replaces his father. So if a son does not replace his father, how could he make that animal into tamura? Answers the Gemara a very strange answer, which we're going to have many times again in this Masechta, which is mikiv'a lo mechapra, mikufia mechapra. It doesn't, kiva means from the kviut, so the permanent part of it is not mechaper. The kufia is, which means like the incidental or the side part of it is mechaper, meaning that there are levels of kapara. There's the main kapara, which is called the kviut, and that does not go over to a son potentially. That's the debate. But even if it doesn't, there's a minor kapara that a son would get in terms of replacing his father, which everyone agrees would happen. So that there are multiple levels of kapara, and although a son doesn't necessarily, again, this was the discussion yesterday, does he replace his father and get a full kapara? He, no matter what, gets a partial, a kufia kapara, which is a minor kapara, and once he gets that, he's strong enough to make it into a tumura, and therefore it's good enough for that purpose. So that is, we're up to the two dots now. We don't resolve the question, yes, from yesterday as to whether a yoresh replaces the father or doesn't replace the father. But ibayl says more now. I got a new question, which we'll see why it's relevant in a minute. Kipru al mashabo olo kipru, right? If a person brings a animal, so remember the Mishnah said that if you bring an animal except for a chatat or a pesach, shelo l'shem ba'alim, it counts as a karban. Does it give the guy a kapara for what he brought? Remember, Reuven came in and said, "I want to bring a karban ola," right? The Kohen takes the karban ola, shechts it for someone else. So the Mishnah said it counts as a good animal, but lo alu lebalim l'shem chova. It doesn't count for Reuven. Reuven's got to bring another karban, right? Maybe he could sue, but he's got to bring another karban. Ask the Gemara, but does he get kapara for what? Remember, he's bringing the ola. Remember, ola is voluntary. The people generally brought an ola for being over a mitzvah aseh. So he, by mistake, I don't know, didn't make Kiddush on Shabbos, right? So he feels really bad. He wants to bring a karban ola, right? And so he brought his karban on Sunday. It didn't happen, right? It happened for someone else. He's got to bring another one. Does he get a kapara for the sin that he wanted to bring it for so that he doesn't get any punishment in the interim till he brings the other karban? So that was the question we asked. Does he get a kapara or not? Says Rav Shesha Brei Ravidi, it makes sense to me, Mistaver lo Kipru. I mean, it seems pretty logical that he wouldn't get a kapara. Because if he got a kapara, the Salkadaitach Kipru, Sheni Lama Huba. So why is he bringing a new karban? What's the purpose of it? He already got atoned for what he did wrong. Okay, so Elamai, so what you then have to say is lo Kipru, he gets no kapara, so Lama Hu Karav. So why are we bringing on the Mizbeach? Right? They make a mistake in the Shechita. The Mishnah says, keep going. It's a fine karban. It just doesn't count for the guy. Well, if it doesn't count for the guy and he's got to bring another one, why don't we just throw it away or something? Says Rav Ashi, so why would you then bring it? So what's your question? Says Rav Ashi, no, it's a little more nuanced than you're making it sound. Rav Shisha Brei Ravidi Hachikakashle. This is what Rav Shisha Brei Ravidi was thinking. If you say that Reuven, whose karban was done incorrectly, does not get a kapara, then I get that you would still want to bring the karban on the mizbeach because shelo lishmo mikach lishmo kaati. you bring it as a karban, even though it was done shelo lishmo, meaning done not for him, because it was started off, it was initiated, the process was done correctly, lishmo. So I get that you want to finish the animal and bring it on the mizbeach, right? So then why does he bring a second one? Sheni lamuhuba. Why do we say in the Mishnah he has to replace it? L'chaper, because he needs to get a kapara for what he wanted to get a kapara for. Eliyam Kipru, but if you say that he gets a kapara from the animal that was done shelo l'shma, so sheni lamuba. Why would you bring a second one? So that was the resolution, is that it seems likely that he gets no kapara, and it's too bad. He's got to bring another karban in order to get a kapara for his sin. So that seems to be our conclusion. But, asked the Gemara, we have another question, and this, again, has nothing to do with our Mishnah directly, but we'll see why we're asking in a second. Ibaylu. A sort of more nuanced question. Remember, generally, a carbon ola, just to remind everyone, we're going to have this throughout the next years of our learning. A carbon ola, a carbon chatat, for example, is brought for a specific sin, right? An asham is brought for specific sins or false testimony, things like that. A shlamim is brought because you basically want to bring gifts to the mizbech and you get the meat home and you get a big steak dinner. An ola is brought as a gift. But the Mishnah says, and we're going to have this again later, that it's generally brought for a person who is over an asay, right? So the Torah does not prescribe any punishment. There's no punishment in the Torah for someone who goes against the mitzvah asay, but we understand that you went against God's will and you might want to atone for that. And a carbon ola can be brought as atonement for that. So let's say a person did, I don't know, again, like let's pick Shabbos, right? He didn't do a mitzvah asay on Shabbos. He didn't make kiddush. He didn't do zachar on Shabbos, right? Or shachar, yeah. So he says, okay, I feel really bad. I want to bring a carbon ola. He Monday sets aside a carbon ola. He comes to the Beit HaMikdash a week later. It turns out he didn't keep the next Shabbos either. So the question is the carbon mechaper for all of the mitzvah say that he did wrong up till the time he brings the carbon, or only up to the time that he dedicated the carbon? Okay. So the question was, I'll read it again. Asay de la'achar hafrasha. A mitzvah say that a person violated after he separated his carbon ola, but before he brought on the mizbeach, is the carbon mechaper or lo mechaper? Mi amrinan, do we say midid avia chatat? Well, let's compare it to a carbon chatat, which is obviously the much more common carbon for sin. Ma chatat, remember chatat, you have to dedicate the chatat for a specific sin. So it has to be kodem hafrasha in. It's only if you did the sin before you separated the animal. It says noda alav chatat shechata, or you have to know about the sin in order to bring a carbon for it. So la'achar frashalo. Obviously, if you didn't know about the sin because you didn't do it yet, by the time you set aside the carbon, your carbon's not mechaper for it. So maybe the same thing is true about an olaf hachanami. Kodem hafrashayin la'achar frashalo. So that's one possibility. Or says well, maybe not. Odilma lo dami lechatat, right? There's a big difference in a carbon ola and a carbon chatat, which is that a chatat al kol chet v'chet bo elatu yichad chatat. Remember, for a carbon chatat, if you do 5 things wrong, you're supposed to bring 5 carbonot. Unless, of course, as we had in Shabbos, you do them all in one forgetting. But if you forget separately, that's Shabbos, and you do one thing, and then you remember, and then you forget, and you remember we had all these cases, you bring 5 chatot, or remember we had all the cases in Masechet Makot, you can do one action and be over 5 or 6 or 7 chatot, right? The Gemara loves those, right? So you have to bring a separate chatat for every sin. But hacha, by an ola, there's no such principle. By an ola, you bring an ola for everything. You bring it once a year. You come in and say, I've done a lot of things wrong. Let me bring a carbon ola. An ola, kivan deika kama aseh gabe mechapra. Even if you've done many mitzvot aseh, it would be mechapra for them. Now, of course, that's if you did them before you brought the ola. But that doesn't resolve for us. Aseh delachar frasha nami mechapra. Maybe it also extends to a mitzvot aseh after you separated the animal. So we don't know the answer. So that is the question. Okay, says let me bring a proof. We're around 12 lines from the bottom. Tashma. The pasuk says v'samach v'nirtza u'nechaper. Right, there's another word here. The Bach adds here v'samach v'nirtzelo lichaper alav. You come, you do smicha, which is when you lean on an animal before you bring it. You say vido, or you say I'm sorry. Nirtza. It provides acceptance, and you get a kapara. This is more v'chismicha mechaperet. Leaning on the animal is not what gives you a kapara. Hello, in kapara ela b'dam. The only way you get a kapara from an animal is when you put the blood on the mizbeach. Shenemar ki adam hu b'nefesh yichaper. Torah very explicitly says it's the blood that causes the kapara. So why does the Torah say that when you lean on it you get a kapara? Elamata malomar v'samach v'nirtzel chaper. Shim asal smicha shiarei mitzvah. Let's say you didn't care about smicha. You made it into shiarei mitzvah, which really comes from like shirayim. Like you made it, secondary, meaning you didn't do it. If you said, I'm bringing a karban, I know I'm supposed to do smicha, it's just like sort of an accoutrement for it. I'm not doing the smicha. So if you skip the smicha, says the Braita, ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu lo kiper v'kiper. Although you did get a kapara, the Torah treats it as if you didn't get a kapara. So meaning, if you skip the smicha, which is not ma'akev, right? It's a machloket, but that's how we're going. So the carbon still works. But the Torah is saying, really, to get a full kapara, you got to do smicha. And if you don't do the smicha, although in fact you get a kapara for your carbon, it's as if you didn't get a kapara. Okay? Now, what does that mean? What does it mean you get and you don't get? So I have a good explanation for this. Lav, the kiper, you get a kapara for the things that you did before you set aside the animal. Asay, the kodem hafrasha. What you don't, meaning for what you did wrong before you set aside this animal for carbon ola. What you don't get a kapara for is the assay that you did during the bringing of the karban. What was the assay you went against during the bringing of the karban? You didn't do smicha. Torah says do smicha. It's a mitzvah assay. You neglected that mitzvah assay. So you might have thought, so what if I neglected? I'm bringing a karban. My karban gives me a kapara for neglecting it. Says the pasuk, you don't get lo kiper assay de smicha. You don't get a kapara for missing smicha. So if you don't do smicha, you get a partial kapara, meaning it still works for what you did before, but it doesn't work for the avera you did right now. Why doesn't it work for the avera you did right now? It must be because you did the avera after you set aside the animal. The havile asay de la'achar hafrasha. It's asay after you set aside the animal. So you can prove from this really interesting braita that if you say, I did a lot of sins, God, I did a lot of mitzvot asay, I want to bring a karban, and you go to the Beit HaMikdash, and in between setting aside the karban and getting to the Beit HaMikdash and doing the karban, you do another sin. The karban does not mechaper on that new sin. The same way it's not mechaper on skipping smicha. Says Rava, that's not a good proof. Amar Rava, asay the smicha ka'amar. You're trying to prove this from smicha. Smicha is different. We're 5 lines from the bottom. Shani hata. Smicha is different because the truth is, and this is a beautiful answer, when you bring a karban to the Beit HaMikdash, you're supposed to lean on it before you shecht it. That mitzvah lasts from the moment, I guess, you get to the Beit HaMikdash until you slaughter it, right? Because the kol kama de lo shachit, as long as you haven't actually slaughtered it, ba'amod usmoch koi, you can still do smicha. So every moment, meaning the Kohen says to you, do smicha, and you're like, I'm too busy, I want to go get a cup of coffee. You just skip it, right? But it doesn't mean you can't do it 5 minutes later. Until they cut off the head of that animal, you can do smicha. So there remains a commandment to go and do smicha until they do shchita. Emat kahavi asay. When are you over the asay that you were supposed to do shchita after they do shchita? Because until the moment they do shchita, you could still fix it. So it's la'achar shchita, or maybe at the moment of shchita, but after they've already started shchita. So then, achar shchita lo komi boile. My question was not, if you bring a karban, can your karban atone for things that you did wrong after you did the karban? Of course it can't atone for things you did after the karban. But maybe it can atone for things that happened after you separated the animal before you brought it up on the mizbeach. So you can't prove anything from smicha because the mitzvah smicha goes up to the slaughtering. And so the time you're over the mitzvah smicha is when you've done the slaughtering. So obviously that's too late. No, that was his answer. Beautiful answer.
You'd have to bring another Ola?
So in theory, you'd have to bring another ola to get a kapara. Yeah. Says Rav Huna
Full kapara. You got a partial kapara.
You get a partial kapara because you get a kapara for everything you did before, right? You brought this ola because 5 weeks ago you did something wrong, but you basically get a new responsibility because you did something wrong in the doing of the ola. Says Rav Huna bar Yehuda Rava, I don't love your proof at all. So your proof was basically that it's a partial kapara because you get a kapara for things that happened in the past. You don't get a kapara for things happening in the present, right? And so that was your proof. Now we just pushed it off for a different reason. But says Rava, I have another Rav Huna bar Yehuda Rava, I have another problem with that. Because maybe what the pasuk is telling you is kiper gavra, you get a kapara as a person, meaning what you did wrong is no longer part of you. Right, which is what kapara is. But turn the page. Lo kiper kabe shmaya. What it means is you don't get a kapara in front of God, meaning God doesn't totally love you anymore, right? As much because you didn't do it perfectly. So you did the letter of the law, you paid your taxes, so to speak, but you didn't make a lot of goodwill with Hashem. Milotznan, we have an example of this. There's a Mishnah in Masechet Nigaim, very interesting Mishnah. The Mishnah says, what's the pasuk? The pasuk says by a mitzorah. A person gets tzarat, they have to bring, when they become tahar, they have to bring a carbon. Part of their carbon is they bring a lug shem, and they bring a pitcher of oil, and it's poured on their nails, remember, on their thumb and their big toe, and on their ears and on their head. Okay, behonot means the tips and on the head, right? And so the pasuk says the following: Hanotar b'shemen ashal kaf, kohen, right? Kaf yada kohen, v'chaper alav v'fnei Hashem, right? Well, you should. I'm skipping the pasuk. I don't have it in front of me because I don't have a fancy Gemara. But basically, it says the extra oil, right? So first, you're supposed to put the oil on the tips of the ears and the fingers and all of that. Then the pasuk says whatever is left behind, right? You should pour on the person's head. Okay, whatever's left, you anoint him. The chaper alav lifnei Hashem, for a kapara in front of Hashem, right? So what that pasuk says Rabbi Akiva, im natan kiper. If you take the extra oil and you pour it on his head, you get a kapara. Im lo natan lo kiper. If you skip this step, you're out of luck. You got to start over. You got to get a new pitcher, do the fingers and the toes, and then pour it on his head. Different Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is very literal in this regard. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, no, it's a nice thing the Torah is saying, but it's not a real mandate. Shiyari mitzvahin. It's not like the same term we had on Amud Aleph. It's like a minor mitzvah. It's like a good idea, but it's not required. Bein nitain, bein lo nitain kiper. Whether you pour it on his head or you don't pour it on his head, he gets a kapara because he's not a mitzvah anymore. But malin alav kilo lo kiper, but we don't like it. So we say you get a kapara by doing this. If you don't do it, you still get a kapara, but it's as if you didn't get a kapara. Now, what does that mean? Kilo lo kiper. What does that mean according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that you get a kapara, but it's as if you did, right? Ilema, if it means you have to do it again, you got to bring it again. Rashi understands karban does not mean another animal, but another lug of shemen, another pitcher of oil, and start over. Then it's not consistent with what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said. Ha'amrit, his words were, bein nitain, bein lo nitain kiper. Whether you do it or don't do it, you get a kapara. Ella, what he must mean is this concept that kiper gavra, that the person gets a kapara. In fact, he followed the rules, he paid his ticket, right? But lo kiper kabe shmaya. But God really doesn't love him because he's not following the rules. And so that's what it means. Hachanami, maybe that's what it means also by smicha. When a person leans on an animal and it says he gets a kapara for doing it, and we said you don't really need to do it, it means you get a kapara without doing it, but God doesn't love it. Hachanami, maybe that's what it means. Says the Gemara, that's very interesting, a very nice pshat, but that's really not what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri means. Because Hatam Nami, here too, I have another explanation for Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying is, Kiper matan behonot. What Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying is that, look, you started the process, right? You put the oil on the tips of this person, his fingers, his toes, and his ears, right? Then the pasuk says, and whatever's left, you pour on his head. You skip that last step. What Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying is, you don't have to make up the things you already did. You get a kapara for matan behonot. The fact that you already put it on his fingers, his toe, etc., that's good. You don't have to repeat that. Rabbi Akiva says you got to start over. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says you're fine, but you've got to get more oil. Lo kiper matanat harosh. You didn't get a kapara for putting on the head, meaning you got to get more oil and pour it on his head. So that's what it means by kiper velo kiper. It means you did what you did and you get credit for it, but you didn't get credit for what you didn't do, and you got to make it up. Unlike Rabbi Akiva, who says that since you didn't take the extra oil and pour it on his head, you got to start from the beginning and get a whole new lug shemen and start from the fingers and the toes. So it's not a proof from Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that there's this concept of minimal kapara, but not, total kapara. So we just haven't proven it. Doesn't mean it's not true, but you can't prove it from this case. Says Gemara, well, let's try one more proof for today. I think we have more than one more. Tashma, we are around 10 lines from the top, the middle of a line on Daf Vav Amud Bet and Masechet Zevachim. Says the Braita, fascinatingly interesting Braita. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon asked a question. Kivtzei atzeret lama heim ba'im. Why do you bring, remember on atzeret, on Shavuos, we bring 2 kvasim, 2 lambs. Why do you bring the 2 lambs? She says, what? Kivtzei atzeret, they're shlamim ninu. What do you mean? What? I mean, we think he means, what are they atoning for? Shlamim are not for atonement, right? Shlamim are for gift to Hashem. Ella, that's not what he means. Sorry, the question of Rabbi Shimon was, Si'irei atzeret lama heim ba'im. Why do you bring a karban sa'ir? Remember, sa'ir was a goat that they brought on every chag. Why do you bring sa'ir echad lechatat? Right, we always quote that. Why did you bring the 2 se'irim on atzeret? Okay, now the 2 se'irim, just interesting, is that usually there's 2. One is mentioned in Vayikra, one's mentioned in Bamidbar. So there's two karbanot seirim that are brought as not a musaf, as a chatat on Atzeret. Why did you bring two seirim? So of course the reason is, and we learned this all in Masechet Shavuot, al tumat mikdash ukdoshav. Remember we had a big machloket about it, but in general we felt that the seirim of Rosh Chodesh and of Chagim were always done, and on Yom Kippur were done for tumat mikdash ukdoshav. Right? They were fascinatingly concerned that someone would mess up in the Beit HaMikdash and that by mistake they would not have the right intention and they'd be tameh or they'd walk into the wrong place, right? There was constant neurosis about tuma, and so they brought karbanot, probably because it happened, right? It was a very chaotic environment, and so they brought karbanot all the time, basically, to forgive the mistakes that were happening along the way, and we call it tumat mikdash ukdoshav, tuma in the Beit HaMikdash or in the karbanot. Okay, so that's why you brought it. Says the Gemara, and this is now a continuation of the Braita, but why did you bring two, right? One karban is mechaper. Why do you need two karbanot for the same purpose on Shavuot? Nizrakta Moshe Rishon. Okay, I get it. You sprinkle the blood of the first animal in the Mizbeach, that's a kapara. So Sheni Lama Karev. So why are you bringing the second one? Says Rabbi Shimon in the Braita, fascinating answer. Al Tuma She'ura Ben Zelazeh. Because, look, you did one in the morning and one 2 hours later, probably something happened in between. So it's never, you got to bring it every minute, basically, because you're doing work in the Beit HaMikdash. There could have been tuma in between. So you did one karban at 10 a.m., you did one karban at noon. You have to bring the second one for tuma that happened in between. Now, of course, by that logic, you should bring them every minute, right? Or every hour. Emar Me'ata, says Rabbi Shimon, says the Braita, really, really, we should constantly bring karbanot because you could always have done the next thing wrong every minute, every hour, whatever. But God has compassion for our money, or the pasuk does at least. It's not practical. But the reason they brought two animals on Shavuot is because to give us this message that for things that happened in between, you should bring another karban. Well, says the Gemara, that's a very interesting point. But remember, Rashi adds, that a tumat mikdash ukdoshav, one of the things that are part of that are mitzvah taseh, right? It says go out of the machaneh, which is a mitzvah taseh. If you don't go out of the machaneh when you're tameh, then you're over a mitzvah taseh. But we are just asking, if you set aside your karban for a mitzvah taseh, right? When is it mechaper, right? Only the things that were up till the time you set it aside, or also things you did afterwards up till the time you brought the karban. So now we're saying there's two karbanot on Shavuot because the second one is mechaper for what happened after the first one. The problem, of course, is that you set aside both animals yesterday, presumably. So if on Erev Shavuot you set aside the two animals, it's only mechaper up to that minute, according to what we're asking now. If it's only mechaper up to that minute, so why do you need two? So let's read that inside. Hahacha here, aseh lachar frasha. We said the second karban is for mechaper for on a mitzvah taseh after the first karban was brought. But that's after it was already separated. We're saying it's mechaper. This is where you're right. If Erev Shavuot you put aside both animals, there's no purpose in bringing a second animal. The question here is, you didn't set them aside at the same time. You put one aside on 10 o'clock in the morning and then brought it, and then you brought the other one aside at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. So there was a space, and that's why you brought the second karban. That's ridiculous. You're telling me that the whole purpose of the Torah of saying bring two karbanot is for this crazy example where you set aside one animal, you wait a long time, you set aside the other one. That's the only time the Torah is referring to that you bring two, that makes sense to bring two karbanot is when you have a distance between setting them aside. So not very logical and not likely to happen. So what you can prove from here is that a mitzvah taseh, you get a kapara up till the time of bringing the karban. And so if that's why on Shavuot, you need two karbanot, the first one's mechaper up to the moment it's brought, the second one's mechaper up till that moment, and there's presumably a time between them. Says Rav Papa, that's not a proof at all. Because the difference in Shavuot and an individual bringing a karban olah is that an individual brings a karban olah, it's his private karban. But on Shavuot, they're karbanot sibor. And karbanot sibor, comrade, you're asking me a question from karbanot sibor. There's a special rule about karbanot sibor. Shani karbanot tzibur, we have a special rule about karbanot tzibur that leiv beitin kamatzna alehem, that there is a condition on every karban tzibur that it's up to the beitin to determine what it's for. Meaning, if Let's read it inside. As Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel said, the Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, karbanot tzibor, when you come out to a public karban, meaning a karban ola, or an asham, or a chatat, or any of these karbanot that musaf, right, things that are brought as a tzibor, sakin moshachtan mashehin. It's the knife that pulls it to what it is, meaning there's a condition that even if on Tuesday afternoon they set aside a karban and said, we're using this on Rosh Hashanah on Thursday, right? That the animal does not determine what it's for until the moment you shech the animals. And that gives basically room for the tzibor to change their mind, right? To say, oh, this carbon is no longer going to be used for that thing. I mean, it's always hektish, but it can be used for something else. And so they made this basically this condition about karbanot tzibor that the only thing that determines its status is the knife. But up till shchita, the animal can be changed. And therefore, the asham that is brought on Shavuot is not set aside the day before. Even if we set it aside, that's not a real setting it aside. It only gets designated the moment it gets slaughtered. And therefore, it makes sense. You might bring two karbanot because one is for the morning and one is for the sins that happen between the morning and the afternoon. Says Gemara, that's a great answer. Amalei Rav Yosef Rav Shmuel Rav Papa, we are 5 lines from the bottom. That's a great answer. The only problem is that the Braita that we quoted was Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon is a Tana who disagrees with that opinion. Does Rabbi Shimon hold that Beit Din has a condition basically on every karban that it's only designated at the time that it's slaughtered? The last line of Daf Vav Amud Bet, what happens to Tmidim shelo hutzruchu l'tzibor, right? And this is partly why Beit Din would do this. Let's say you had a carbon tamid. Remember that we're going to have the mission tamid eventually, but they would set aside a carbon tamid. Remember the carbon tamid had to be put aside 3 days before and sit for 4 days basically, whatever, the fourth day before. So remember, every year they had to bring carbonot from the money of that year. And when you hit Rosh Chodesh Nisan, you got to use new money. So let's say you have a karban tamid that was set aside, and you hit the new year, and you can't use this karban tamid from last year for this year, right? It was bought with money from last year. It was set aside for karban tamid, and now it's a new year. So what do you do? Or let's say something else happens. Let's say, they were really nervous. Animals were dying a lot. They set aside 4 animals for tomorrow's tamid, and they only needed 2 of them, right? So tmidim shlo hutzruchu l'tzibor. Says this whole retzef of rabbis, Rav Idi bar Avin, Rav Amnon, Rav Yitzchak, and Rav Yochanan, top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, the divrei Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, there's nothing to do about it. Ein niftin tmimim. You can't redeem them if they are still whole, meaning you can't say, I want to exchange the kedusha from this karban tamid on money, and then take that money and buy the animal back, basically, or buy a new karban tamid, because they have kedusha. And unless they get a mum, once they get a mum, you can redeem it. But as long as they're tamim, you can't redeem them. And the divrei chachamim, niftim tamimim, the chachamim say, no problem. You can be poded tamimim, right? But this basically is based on the principle of leiv beit din matan alehem, right? Does beit din have a control to say, although we separated this for a tamid, we can change our mind and say it's not a tamid. According to the chachamim, they can, but Rabbi Shimon says you can't. So this seems to be very problematic to that answer. The ode, and furthermore, we have another question. And the further question at the second line of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, I'm going to read it quickly to the 2 dots. Habai minei Reb Yirmiyah Reb Zera. Reb Yirmiyah asked Reb Zera the following question, right? Let's say you have Seirei Atzeret. Remember, the Seirei Atzeret are unique because there's 2 karbanot, right? So there's 2 karbanot for Seir, which presumably do the same thing. So we asked earlier why we have 2, and we said maybe it's because of things that happen in between them, right? Says the bright, I'm sorry, not Reb Yirmiyah asked Reb Zera, what if you have 2 Seirei Atzeret, right? The 2 Seirei Atzeret, Shekibel damam b'shnei kosot. They were slaughtered and they're at the same time, and they cut their blood in 2 different cups because they're 2 different animals. V'nizrak damo shel rishon, and you poured out the blood of the first one. Now, you did a kapara. So says Rabbi Yirmiyah from Reb Zera, Sheni lama huba. Why do you need to bring the second one? There's nothing. What's the second one for? You brought the first one. It's a kapara. He answered him, Al tuma shira ben zrika shel zeh zrika shel zeh. Right? It's for tuma that happened between sprinkling the blood of one and sprinkling the blood of the other. Says, come on, 1 second. Ad kan look at me by right? We just remember. So now you're talking about where you shechted 2 animals, right? Let's say at the same time, and then you sprinkled one, and then maybe someone did a sin. If you sprinkle the other one, the question is it mechaper or not mechaper? But it seems that he's taking for granted that if you did a sin after the hafrasha, but before the shechita, it would be mechaper. He didn't even ask him that question. He only asked him an assay after the slaughtering, before the zrika, but assumed that an assay after the hafrasha and before the shechita would be fine. It would be mechaper for that. And that's the question we started off today with, which is, if you do a mitzvah assay and you're over after you separate the animal, is it mechaper when you do the shechita? It seems like he's taking for granted that he is. So we're not necessarily, because Dilma imtim salam kamar. Maybe he's saying, no, I don't know the answer. Meaning, we haven't resolved the question of what happens to Naseh that's between Hafrasha and Shechita. But my question is, take it further. What happens to a Naseh that happens in Shechita and Zrika? But it's not saying that I know for sure the answer to one question. He's saying, if you resolve that question, I have another one. But it doesn't prove the answer. And we're going to leave today, and we're not going to answer this, that we don't have an answer to this question. So you're going to have to remain stumped about whether, if you do a mitzvah taseh, you're over a mitzvah taseh after you separate an animal, whether the carbon, the shechita of that animal is going to be mechaper on the new mitzvah taseh, or whether you have to bring another carbon. And so we don't resolve it. The Gemara leaned very strongly towards saying that it does, but we did not prove it. So we'll stop there. We're at the 2 dots, so we got a good way down, which is good. God willing, tomorrow morning, we will pick it up at 7:45 a.m. Eastern time, or 8:45 a.m. Bermuda time, if you're in Bermuda.
As some of us are.
Charlie,
Did we decide if smicha was a if you skip smicha, you still have to bring another korban?
So that we did not resolve that. So remember that, just to be clear, smicha is not ma'akev according to this opinion. We're going to get to smicha when we'll get there. There's a whole, not a masechah, but a whole discussion about it, in Kriton. But the thing about the thing I wanted to say, James, is that the requirement to bring a korban for a mitzvah taseh is not something that Beit Din will force you. Meaning, the Torah doesn't say it. It's sort of like, if you want to get a kapara, you want to please God, you bring a korban. So what we're saying is that presumably everyone agrees that if you skip smicha, you were over a mitzvah taseh, and if you want to properly atone for that, you have to bring a new korban ola. And hopefully you do smicha on the new korban, or you'll keep going on bringing korban out your whole life.
Okay.
Okay.
There is such a thing as a
Sorry?
voluntary, they call communal olot. And there's a whole discussion in the Mishnah and Shkalim whether between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, what one should, if and how and when, what can bring that. But there are voluntary olot which don't necessarily involve a sin. And the reserve,
Correct.
voluntary could be for the individual, it could be for the community olot, and they set up collection boxes.
Well, one second. There's 2 different things there, but yeah, the answer was
That's more than 2 different things. There are many things.
Well, true, but absolutely, a person can just wake up in the morning and say, I love God, I appreciate God, I want to bring a sacrifice. It doesn't have to come for a sin. But we do say that if a person's over a mitzvah taseh, where there's Torah does not mandate any kind of punishment, that is where a person is encouraged to bring an olah to get forgiveness for that. But the second thing you're referring to is the Mishnah in Shkalim, where they set up the kupot. We had to all bring a shekel, right? That was machzita shekel in order to bring karbanot tzibor, like the karban olah and the musaf and things like that. Which some of those were karban tamin is what I meant. Sorry, the morning tamin.
Well, there's no more than that. The Mishnah talks about 13 gates and 13 tables and collection boxes, multiple. And each collection box are designated, and then for instance, kinim, or for gozle, olot, or things like that. So that's something else. That's a little bit more than just the machzit shekel.
Okay, perfect.
No.
Let us adjourn, and God willing, I'll see you all tomorrow morning, bright and early. Shavua tov.
Shavua tov.
And they,
No difficult to follow what he's saying. It's all over the map. Talk to it. A little bit all over